It happened on a Tuesday night. Cold, brutally cold. One of those New York evenings where the wind doesn't just bite at bruises. A gust came screaming down Astoria Boulevard, lifting plastic bags like ghosts and slamming every door that wasn't locked. But the loudest noise that night wasn't the wind. It was a child crying. A sharp, panicked cry that cut through car alarms and bus exhaust and reached a place inside you that doesn't have a name. Her name was Alina. She was 4 years old, bundled in 2 jackets that didn't quite fit. Standing next to a mattress, her mattress dumped onto the sidewalk like yesterday's trash. Her mother stood beside her, one hand on a torn suitcase, the other shaking with fury or shame or just cold. A security guard from Rebney, a private firm hired by one of New York's biggest real estate syndicates, stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, sunglasses on, at 9:41 p.m. "This unit is cleared," he barked. "No legal residency, no valid lease." The woman tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "I don't know about you, but when I saw that footage, I didn't feel angry. I felt something worse, numb. Like this city had become too used to cruelty. Like watching families get thrown into the street was just part of the Tuesday news cycle." But then someone walked in. He didn't run, didn't raise his voice. He just crossed the yellow caution tape like it wasn't there, and sat down. Right there, in the snow, next to the little girl. No coat, no cameras, just corduroy pants, a scarf, and the kind of silence that says more than any megaphone. His name was Zohran Mamdani. A state assemblyman, a rapper, a son of immigrants, a politician with no power over this agency. No jurisdiction over this eviction, no legal right to intervene. But he came anyway, and when reporters asked later why, he just said, "Because no one else did." That line stuck with me, because I've seen a lot of leaders talk, shout, perform, but sitting in snow with a child you've never met, that's something else. That's not policy. That's presence. The guard tried to shoo him away. "Sir, this is private property." Mamdani looked up, not defiantly, just steadily. "Then arrest me," he said, and returned his gaze to the little girl. Not a word more, just his hand gently brushing snow off her hair. For 6 minutes, nothing happened. And in those 6 minutes, everything changed. Traffic slowed. Bystanders pulled out phones not to record, but to cry. A cab driver parked and brought them tea. An old woman across the street lit a candle in her window, and the eviction quietly paused. Not officially, not legally, but spiritually. Like the city itself took a breath and asked, "What are we doing?" I'll be honest, I've never voted for Mamdani. Don't agree with him on everything. But that night wasn't about politics. It was about posture, about what kind of people we become when no one's watching, and whether we're brave enough to sit in the cold without needing to be right, or thanked, or filmed. The next morning, Rebney denied wrongdoing, issued a statement about compliance and protocol, but no one remembered the memo. They remembered the silence, the snow, the little girl whose tears turned to steam when someone finally sat beside her. That's how stories change things. Not by shouting, by showing. And if this part hurts to hear, maybe that's good. Because some truths should. And some nights should never be quiet again. The footage went viral overnight. Not in the way political clips usually do. It wasn't loud, it wasn't branded. There was no hashtag, no campaign logo, no triumphant soundtrack. Just a man in a scarf sitting in the snow beside a child whose home was being erased. But by morning, the machine had already woken up. And it did what it always does when something too human breaks through its spun. Headlines cropped up fast. Assemblyman stages stunt at illegal eviction. Leftist lawmaker disrupts lawful property action. Mamdani undermines due process. The words weren't meant to inform. They were meant to erode. He was invited to defend himself on a morning radio show. The host called him a political performer in poet's clothing, said his scarf was clearly chosen for optics. When Mamdani answered quietly, "It was knitted by my mother," the host laughed. Cut to commercial. That afternoon, Rebney released a memo to all its partners. It accused him of obstruction of operational protocol and inciting residential instability. A board member called him a threat to institutional consistency. No one explained what that meant, but it sounded official enough for the evening news. Behind the scenes, things got worse. 3 of his colleagues in the assembly issued statements distancing themselves from the incident. One said, "While we respect the compassion shown, we must all work within the limits of law and order." Another warned that Mamdani was creating false hope in constituents who should be guided toward legal remedy, not dramatics. He was pulled from 2 committee projects. Invitations to forums he had helped organize vanished. At one point, a proposal he had worked on for 9 months on tenant protections was shelved without explanation. No vote, just vanished. But the worst came quietly. Late at night, in anonymous emails. "You're an embarrassment to your father. Go back to Uganda, you anti-American terrorist. We know where your wife teaches her dance classes." Mamdani didn't respond. Not publicly, not even in private. He just showed up to work, took the subway, sat through hearings, smiled when spoken to, listened when ignored. And then after sundown he walked, every night, past the shelters, the underpasses, the benches near Queensbridge Park, past the motels turned makeshift housing, past the graffiti that used to say "no future" here and now just said "no rent." He carried a thermos of tea and a pack of blank index cards. He didn't film it, didn't post, didn't tell his staff. But people noticed. A man named Raoul, who slept near an auto shop, said he sat next to me and just asked what I missed most. I said my daughter's music. He said nothing, just wrote something down. One night he walked past an eviction in progress. No crowd, no cameras. Just a mother pushing a stroller with one hand and dragging a suitcase with the other. Her toddler was asleep, his face wrapped in a hoodie. Mamdani didn't interfere, didn't speak. He just offered her the thermos. She took it. Their eyes met. And then she walked on. That's how he resisted. Not with noise, with presence. And as the city buzzed with headlines and spin, he became quieter. Not weaker, not smaller. Just more precise, more still. As if he understood something the rest of us had forgotten, that some battles aren't fought with words. They're endured with witness. The first time it really hurt wasn't during the interviews or the headlines. It wasn't the death threats or the slurs or the "go back to your country" calls whispered through cracked phone lines. It wasn't even the vote he lost in committee by a margin engineered behind closed doors. It was a conversation outside a halal food cart on 31st Avenue. The vendor, Samir, had known Zohran for years. He'd catered his community events, kept samosas warm late, when speeches ran long, called him Beta with fatherly affection. That night Samir saw him walking home. He didn't wave, he didn't nod. Just looked down and said, "You should have left it alone." Zohran paused. "Left what?" The eviction, Samir said, eyes not meeting his. "It's not your fight. Those people, no papers, no future. You risk everything for them, and for what?" It landed deeper than anything that came from Rebni, because it wasn't about politics, it was about belonging. And here was someone from his own diaspora, someone who once told him, "You remind me of my son," now saying, "You're too much." That night Mamdani didn't go home. He walked, kept walking, past bodegas and closed laundromats, past old women sweeping their stoops and teenagers rehearsing verses in alleyways. He ended up in a church basement where undocumented immigrants met weekly to swap information and grief. They welcomed him with nervous warmth. One woman asked, "You're the snow guy." He nodded. She offered him a folding chair. He sat. They talked for hours. Not about strategy, about dreams, about what it felt like to live in a city that smiled at your labor but spat on your presence. A man named Hector said, "My daughter was born here, but she whispers, like she's afraid her voice is illegal." Mamdani listened, wrote nothing down, said almost nothing back. But when he left, one of the mothers slipped a note into his coat pocket. It read, "You're not too much, you're just on time." But the pain wasn't over. Online former supporters began to question his priorities. Why isn't he focusing on our rent? Why is he always defending people who don't even vote? He cares more about drama than data. At a town hall, a man stood up and asked Assemblyman, "When did you decide that making statements was more important than making laws?" Mamdani answered with a line no one quoted. "When the law refuses to recognize suffering, the statement is the action." But no one heard that part. They just heard snow protest disruption. He began to feel it in small ways. Invitations went unreturned. Emails delayed. Colleagues spoke over him during hearings. A memo circulated suggesting his staff was over-engaged in non-legislative matters. Someone spray-painted fraud on his office window. But he didn't flinch. He started coming in earlier, leaving later. Every week he hosted free legal clinics, not just for constituents, but for anyone. No ID required. No questions asked. One night a woman came to the door with 2 kids and no shoes. He gave her his, just handed them over and said, "I'll be fine." And he was. Not because he was strong, but because he remembered something his mother once told him. "Son, if they don't bruise you, you're not close enough." By now, even those who doubted him had begun to watch differently. They didn't agree, but they couldn't deny his consistency, his presence, his refusal to weaponize pain, even when the knives came fast. He never struck back. He just stood there, a little bruised, a little quieter, but still present. Still listening. Still carrying a thermos, still writing down stories, still showing up. Not because he believed he could fix it all, but because he believed no one should face it all alone. The invitation came with fanfare, primetime slot, high ratings, a chance to clarify the controversy. They framed it as a debate. Mamdani versus the senior counsel of Rebni, law versus emotion, policy versus protest, fireworks guaranteed. The host was a man known for interruptions. His monologues went viral. His catchphrases sold mugs. "This is America, not a therapy session," he liked to say. He opened the segment with a smirk. "Our next guest thinks sitting in snow is a housing strategy." The audience laughed. Mamdani didn't. He walked in quietly. No entourage, no stylist. He wore the same coat from that night, a little frayed at the sleeve, faint salt stains from the sidewalk. The host began the attack. "You disrupted a legal eviction. Do you think you're above the law?" Mamdani didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small brown paper sack. He placed it on the table between them. "What's that?" the host asked, eyebrow raised. He opened it. Slowly. Inside were 4 items: a plastic doll with one arm, a crayon worn down to the paper, a coin with a flower scratched on one side, and a note written in pencil on a napkin. It read, "Please don't throw these out. They're my treasures. Silence." The host blinked. "Is this from the eviction?" Mamdani nodded. The room shifted. He didn't shout, didn't explain. Just looked straight into the camera and said, "I'm not here to win a debate. I'm here to ask one question. Who explains this to the child whose world was boxed and dumped on a curb?" The audience went still. The Rebni lawyer cleared his throat. "With respect, we're not in the business of toys. We're in the business of property rights." Mamdani didn't flinch. "Exactly. And that's the problem. We treat homes like contracts, not containers of memory." The host tried to regain control. "Assemblyman, no one wants families evicted, but law is law. Do you propose we ignore it for emotion?" He leaned forward, not with aggression, but weight. "Law should serve life. If it doesn't, it's not justice, it's machinery." And then he did something even stranger. He slid the napkin toward the lawyer. Gently. "Would you return this? Or toss it with the mattress?" No one spoke. A moment passed. And then from the back of the audience, a voice broke through. A woman stood, mid-30s, blazer, shaking. "I used to work for Rebni," she said, "in admin. I processed 200 evictions in a single month. I cried every night. But I told myself, this is just how it works." She looked at the napkin. "I was wrong." Tears ran down her cheek. "I don't know you, Assemblyman, but thank you for not playing the game." The crowd erupted not in applause, but in silence. That thick, holy kind of silence where no one breathes too loud, afraid to break what's happening. The host stammered something about needing to move on, but everyone knew the segment was over. Not because time ran out, because truth had walked in and sat quietly, like snow. The day after the broadcast, something strange happened. Mamdani's office received 12 letters, all handwritten, no return addresses. Each one contained a sentence that began the same way I was part of it. Some were short. Just a line or two. I cut the keys, one read. I removed the door hinges. Another confessed. I drove the truck. But one stood out. It came in a plain, white envelope taped shut. Inside was a 5-page letter. No signature. Just a date, January 4th. The night of the eviction. It was from a man named Derek, a private security guard. He wrote, "I was the one who told them to leave. I stood between a mother and her child and called it compliance. I didn't look her in the eye. I had my orders." He described the moment Mamdani sat down in the snow. I thought it was a stunt. Another politician playing hero. But then, he didn't move. For minutes, I kept waiting for him to grandstand, to shout, but he just sat there brushing snow off that little girl's hair, like he was her uncle or something. Then came the line that stopped Mamdani cold. That's when I realized I hadn't touched another person with kindness in 4 years. Derek went on to explain how after the eviction he went home to his own daughter. She asked why his hands were shaking. I told her it was the cold, but it wasn't. He ended with this. "I don't know if this letter will reach you, but if it does, please tell the girl I'm sorry. I still have the stuffed rabbit. I picked it up after she dropped it. I didn't throw it away. I just couldn't." Mamdani folded the letter and sat in his office for hours. Didn't speak, didn't move. Just held the paper like it was made of something ancient and fragile. That week he brought it to a town hall. He didn't name Derek. Didn't wave the letter in front of cameras. He just read one line. I hadn't touched another person with kindness in 4 years. And then he looked up and said, "That's what our housing system does. Not just to families, but to the people we make enforce it." The room was silent. A janitor near the back, a man no one usually noticed, wiped his eyes with his sleeve. After the event, a woman approached Mamdani. She was quiet, carried a bag from a pharmacy. "I was the clerk who printed their file. The eviction notice," she whispered. "I didn't know they had a kid. I just hit print." Mamdani didn't judge. He didn't even nod. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Then print this next time a child lived here." That night someone left the stuffed rabbit at Mamdani's office door. No note. No one claimed it. He placed it in a glass box. Not for display. For memory. It was Wednesday. Mid-afternoon. The chamber was packed with suits. Papers shuffled. Mics buzzed. Council members whispered in corners, checking phones, flipping through binders. Outside the temperature was 15 degrees. Inside the thermostat read 72. And the coffee was still warm. Zohran Mamdani stepped to the podium. No slides, no staffer handing him talking points, no script, just the same worn coat. And in his pocket, a stuffed rabbit. He cleared his throat. Not to get attention, just to mark the start. "I'm not here to convince you," he began. "I'm here to remind you." Half the room looked up. The other half didn't. "You all know the numbers. You've read the reports. The cost of evictions, the vacancy rates, the tax subsidies. You've got charts. I've seen them." He paused. "But I want to talk about a window." Now the silence grew. It was cracked, just above the radiator. The wind got through, I remember, because the girl's blanket kept flapping. She pulled it tighter each time. Like if she could just hold still enough, the cold would forget she was there. He reached into his coat and placed something on the table, the paper sack. "She left this, a crayon, a note, a coin, a rabbit," one councilman scoffed. "Assemblyman, we're discussing legal frameworks." Zohran didn't raise his voice. "Then let's discuss what framework accounts for a 4-year-old's treasures being thrown into the street. Let's quantify that." A woman near the dais stirred uncomfortably. "No, we can't." "Then maybe this room doesn't need more charts. Maybe it needs a field trip." Someone laughed, short, nervous. "Come with me," he said, "tonight. 1 block from Queensbridge. I'll bring blankets. You bring silence. Sit for 20 minutes on the pavement. Don't speak. Don't explain. Just listen. Another voice cut in. "That's not procedure." He turned not angry, but tired. "Exactly. Procedure protects us from proximity." And then he looked directly at the chairman. "Mr. Liu, you once told a story here. About your mother losing her job in 1989. About how she cried on the kitchen floor. I remember that. We all do. Because it was real, not documented, real." Liu blinked. "I'm not asking you to vote for a bill. I'm asking you to remember who you were when you couldn't afford to forget." No one moved. The microphone clicked off. His time was up. But before stepping down, Mamdani said one last thing. "The girl's name is Alina. She asked me if snow was supposed to burn. I told her no. But I lied." He left the rabbit on the table and walked out. No applause, no protest. Just the quiet sound of guilt starting to breathe. It started as a whisper. An anonymous post on a community blog. A screenshot. A link to a Google Drive folder. No commentary. Just a title, Rebni Files. Most people ignored it. But a reporter from an independent housing justice zine clicked. And what she found made her stop breathing. Inside were spreadsheets, contracts, emails. One line stood out. Shift evictions to midweek. Less media noise. Avoid Friday's optics risk. The documents revealed a pattern. Rebni had orchestrated mass evictions, 87 in the past 3 months, concentrated in immigrant neighborhoods, all timed to fall just outside major news cycles, all targeting units just below rent stabilization thresholds. They weren't random. They were surgical. More files followed. Tax returns showing that Rebni-affiliated LLCs claimed $42 million in city subsidies while simultaneously increasing non-voluntary turnover by 38%. Memos instructing staff to avoid visible force but ensure assertive posture for rapid compliance. Photos of children's drawings on walls circled with red pen mark for repaint. Within 48 hours, the story was everywhere. But it wasn't the files that lit the match. It was a live stream. A teenager named Luis, who lived 3 blocks from the eviction site, had been filming quietly for weeks. His YouTube channel had 312 followers. That night he posted a video titled, "He Still Comes." It showed Mamdani, alone, walking, every evening, same route, same thermos, sitting with people, writing names, never filming, never speaking more than needed. Then came the shot, a close-up of Mamdani taking off his coat, wrapping it around a sleeping man on a bench, then leaving without a word. No music, no narration, just a title card leadership is showing up when no one asks. The video went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it wasn't. In a world of filters and flashpoints, it was still. The RebNI spokesperson issued a press release calling the footage political theater. But no one cared, because while they released PDFs, the people released memory. An elderly woman called into a local radio show. "He helped fix my space heater," she said, voice trembling. Didn't announce it, just knocked tools in hand. A librarian tweeted, "He brings books to kids who can't get cards." One by one the noise changed, from mockery to murmurs, from dismissal to defense. Even the press began to shift. A prominent anchor known for neutrality opened her show with a single line. "Tonight we talk about a man who didn't raise his voice but raised ours." And at the heart of it all was that live stream. Luis the teen got an email from a documentary filmmaker. He replied, "I don't need a deal. I just needed people to see what I see." The hearing room was packed again, this time not with lobbyists, but with people. Grandmothers in wool hats, fathers holding toddlers, teenagers in thrift store hoodies. There was no banner, no chant, just a kind of sacred hush, the kind that only comes when people show up not to shout, but to witness. Mamdani stood near the back. He hadn't planned to speak. He'd said enough. Too much, maybe. The headlines were quieting. Rebni was ducking, and the city council was beginning to blink under the light. But what happened that day wasn't in the agenda. It walked in quietly. No press, no announcement. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, slipped into the back row. No staffer in tow, no media in tow. Just her, in jeans and a gray sweater, hair tied up, a notebook tucked under her arm. She didn't wave, didn't move to the dais. She sat, second to last row, next to a woman who had brought her lunch in a plastic grocery bag. Someone whispered, "Is that?" and then fell silent. The hearing began. Policy points were read aloud, amendments debated. But the temperature in the room had changed. One by one, speakers from the community stood up. A janitor, a former eviction agent, a teenage girl who had once lived in a shelter and now ran her high school debate team. Each told a story, and AOC sat there, taking notes, sometimes nodding, sometimes biting her lip, but never interrupting, never performing. Then came the moment. A council member, visibly agitated, glanced toward Mamdani. "I think we've heard enough anecdotes. This is legislation, not literature." The room shifted, and for the first time AOC raised her hand. "Not high, just enough to be noticed." The chairman paused. "Yes, Representative." She didn't rise. She just said clearly, "Sometimes legislation comes from literature, and literature comes from pain. If you can't write policy that reflects the stories you refuse to hear, then you're not writing law, you're signing silence." The room froze. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Afterward, she slipped out as quietly as she came in. Left no soundbite, no tweet. Someone asked her in the hallway, "Why come today?" She smiled, small, and said, "I didn't come to speak, I came to witness, because sometimes that's enough." Mamdani didn't follow her out. He stayed. 'Cause that's what he did. He stayed, and the people stayed with him. They asked him weeks later why he didn't fight back harder, why he never shouted, why he didn't seize the moment. He just smiled slowly and said, "Because I was raised by silence." And then he told the story, not to the press, not on a podium, but in a circle one night in a church basement where 10 people sat on folding chairs waiting for free legal advice. One man asked, "Why do you care so much?" And Mamdani looked down. "Because I remember what exile smells like." He told them about his father, a scholar expelled from Uganda during Idi Amin's regime. One day he had a home. The next he had only what he could carry. He was 23, a stranger in every country that would take him. But he carried books, always books, even when hungry. He told me Mamdani said that law is what took his country away, but it was also law that let him study. That gave him a voice. So the same tool that silenced him became his weapon. Then he spoke of his mother, a filmmaker, a woman who spent her life documenting people no one remembered. Her documentaries didn't win Oscars. They won tears. They told of bus drivers fired without notice, cleaners with 3 jobs and no sick days, refugees with diplomas that meant nothing in America. My mother believed that truth wasn't what you say, it's what you sit with. He paused. So I learned to sit. He looked around the room. I didn't choose activism. I was born into grief, and I learned that justice isn't just about laws. It's about memory. There was silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that feels like prayer. He folded a napkin in his hands out of habit, then said, "My father once told me if your people ever get power, remember how it felt not to have any." And my mother added, "Never film someone's pain unless you're willing to hold it." That night after the clinic ended, a woman handed Mamdani a drawing. It was of a rabbit, crude, childlike, but at the bottom it read, "Thank you for sitting with us." He folded it carefully, placed it next to the others. Not in a folder, in his breast pocket, where his father used to keep a pocket Quran, and his mother kept a lens cloth, because stories like faith only matter when carried close. The letters started arriving in spring, scrawled in crayon, spelled wrong, smudged with peanut butter and fingerprints. Most of them began the same way. "Dear Snowman." No title, no representative, no Assemblyman Mamdani, just Snowman. They came from kids, dozens, then hundreds, some from Queens, some from Staten Island, one from Ohio. One envelope had a drawing of a snowflake with a heart inside. Another had a stick figure sitting next to a smaller stick figure, holding hands both surrounded by blue squiggles. Alina's letter came last. The little girl, the one from the sidewalk. Her handwriting had improved, barely. It read, "Dear Snowman. Mommy said you didn't have to sit, but you did. That made me feel like maybe I was not invisible. Do you think snow is sad? I think it is. But you made it warm. Mamdani kept that one on his desk. Not framed. Just there. Folded. Touched. One afternoon, his staff found him staring at it. Not crying, not speaking. Just still. Later that week, he went to visit Alina and her mother. They were now in temporary housing. 1 room, 2 beds, a kitchenette, no lease. But that day it was filled with sun. Alina ran to the door. She wasn't crying. She was laughing. She held out a new drawing. This time it was better. More detail. The snowman wore a scarf, and he was holding not just a hand, but a home. A small house drawn in crayon balanced in his arms. Inside the house were stick figures. A mom, a child, and a rabbit. I added a heater this time, she said proudly, so nobody gets snowburned. He laughed. Not to be polite, but because it felt like a kind of healing. Then she said the line, the one that would travel further than any speech. You didn't come to melt the snow. You came to sit in it. That's why it melted. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Some truths don't need to be repeated. Just remembered, they say snow melts in silence. Not in fire, not in protest, just warmth, quiet warmth. Maybe that's what Zohran Mamdani understood better than most. He didn't run a revolution. He didn't shout people into change. He just showed up, 1 bench at a time, 1 folded napkin at a time, and in doing so reminded us that presence is power. Real power. The kind that doesn't need votes to matter. So if you're watching this right now and you're thinking, what can I do? I'm not an assemblyman. I'm not a lawmaker. I'm just me. Remember this. He wasn't elected to sit in snow. He chose to. Because no title, no office, no job description can ever define the moment you decide to be human. Maybe you won't sit in snow. Maybe yours is a hospital waiting room. A funeral nobody attends. A neighbor who hasn't been seen in weeks. A single mom crying in the laundry room. A veteran at the bus stop who flinches at kindness. Wherever your snow is, sit. Just sit. No camera, no applause, no agenda, just presence. Because that's where the thaw begins. That's how cities change. Not with storms, but with people who are brave enough to stay when it's cold. And if you're wondering whether one small act of presence makes a difference, ask Alina. She'll tell you. Snow burns less when someone is beside you.